Hey, my name's Jesse Moran. I'm 31 years old, and I run a small craft bourbon distillery just outside Bardstown, Kentucky, right in the heart of bourbon country where the air smells like charred oak and caramel if the wind's blowing right. It's not some massive operation, like the big names you see on liquor store shelves. Just a small batch outfit my dad started 20 years ago and left to me when he died 3 years back from a heart attack that came out of nowhere. One day he was teaching me how to proof down a barrel. The next he was gone. And I was left holding the keys to a business I barely understood the legal side of. The distillery's in a converted warehouse on about 5 acres, with a 500-gallon copper still that shines like a penny when the sun hits it, a rickhouse out back with 200 barrels aging at various stages, and a little tasting room up front where bourbon trail tourists stop by on weekends. I live in the apartment above the production floor, which means I fall asleep to the smell of fermenting mash and wake up to the same. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. We produce maybe 2,000 bottles a year, sell them at local liquor stores and to visitors, and I make just enough to keep the lights on and the TTB, that's the Federal Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, off my back with their endless paperwork and inspections. Life's simple. I wake up early, check the fermenters to make sure the yeast is doing its job, rotate barrels in the rickhouse so they age even, bottle whatever's ready, and spend afternoons pouring samples for tourists who want to know the difference between weeded and rye bourbon. Evenings, I'm usually tinkering with recipes, trying to get closer to the stuff my dad used to make. The kind of bourbon that made old-timers at industry events shake his hand and say it. Reminded them of the old days before. Prohibition killed half the craft. That Thursday morning in late April started normal enough. I was in the rickhouse doing barrel inventory, rolling a 4-year-old barrel to check for leaks, when my phone rang from my back pocket. Unknown Kentucky number. I almost didn't answer. Figured it was another sales call about upgrading my bottling line or some distributor I'd never heard of, but something made me swipe to pick up. The voice on the other end was a man, late 40s maybe, with that nervous edge people get when they're about to ask you for money. "Mr. Moran," he said. "My name's Roy Brennan. I'm calling from Louisville. I owe you money, $80,000 for equipment and consulting your father, provided a couple years back. I can't pay it right now, but I'm sending my niece Ivy to work it off. She'll be there tomorrow." I stood there in the rickhouse with a barrel, bung in one hand and my phone in the other, completely thrown. "I don't know who you are, but I never sold anyone equipment. You've got the wrong person." He kept talking like I hadn't said anything. "Your father set it up before he passed. Check his records. She's a hard worker. She'll do whatever you need. She'll be there by afternoon tomorrow." And he hung up before I could tell him he was out of his mind. I spent the rest of the day digging through my dad's files in the office. Old invoices and customer records and bank statements going back 5 years. There was no Roy Brennan anywhere. No equipment sales, because we don't sell equipment, we make bourbon. No consulting fees, because Dad didn't do that either. The whole thing smelled wrong, but I couldn't figure the angle. I called Tom Ridley, the lawyer who handles my federal licensing stuff. And he said, don't let her work without proper paperwork. It could violate about 15 different labor laws, and to send her away the second she showed up. But I didn't, because the next afternoon at 2:30, an old pickup truck with more rust than paint pulled into my gravel lot, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been carrying the weight of the world for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. She was probably 26, 27, with auburn hair pulled back in a braid that was practical. Not pretty, wearing faded jeans and a UK Wildcats t-shirt that had seen better days and work boots that were scuffed to hell. She had a duffel bag over one shoulder and a manila folder clutched in her other hand. And when she walked into the tasting room where I was restocking bottles behind the bar, she looked me right in the eye and said the thing that would end up changing everything. "I'm Ivy Brennan. My Uncle Roy sent me to repay his debt. He said I'd be working here until it's settled." I set down the bottle I was holding, came around the bar. "I never loaned your uncle money. There's been some kind of mistake." Her face did this thing where hope and fear fought each other for a second. Then she just looked tired. "He said you'd have the paperwork, that your father set it up." She held out the folder. "It's all in here." We went back to my office, a cramped room that smelled like old paper and bourbon fumes, with my dad's photos still on the wall because I couldn't bring myself to take them down. She sat across from my desk and opened the folder, slid the papers over. It was an invoice on letterhead that said Moran Craft Distillery, dated 2 years ago, listing out copper steel components for $45,000, grain supplier contracts for $20, and master distiller consulting for $15. At the bottom was a signature that looked enough like my dad's to make my stomach drop, and a notary seal from Louisville. I picked it up, held it to the light, studied the signature. It was close, real close, but something was off. The loop on the capital M was wrong, too tight. And my dad always dated things with the full year, not just the last 2 digits. But it was good enough that if I didn't know better, I might have believed it. "Where'd you get this?" I asked. "Uncle Roy gave it to me last month. Said it was time to settle up. That if I didn't work off the debt, he'd lose everything." She swallowed hard, and I could see she was trying not to cry. "I've been sending him money for years, working 2 jobs in Louisville trying to help him." I thought this would finally clear it. I sat back in my chair, looking at this woman who'd been lied to by someone she trusted, sent out here to God knows what kind of situation. And I made a choice that probably wasn't smart but felt right. "Stay tonight. I've got a guest room upstairs. Tomorrow we'll figure out if this is real. And if it's not, you deserve to know the truth. But either way, you're not working for free. We'll do a proper employment contract, minimum wage, legal hours, room and board. You're not a debt. You're a person." She did cry then, just a little, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you. I didn't know what to expect when I drove down here." I showed her the spare apartment on the 2nd floor. A simple place. I usually saved for bourbon writers doing stories on small distilleries, and told her to get settled. That night I made bourbon-glazed pork chops. Something my dad taught me. Because he said any distiller who can't cook with his own product isn't worth his salt. And we ate at the small table in my place. She talked a little about growing up with her uncle after her. Parents died in a car crash when she was 12. About working at his auto shop in Louisville. About never finishing college because the money wasn't there. After dinner, I took her down to the rick house. Showed her the rows of barrels stacked 3 high. Explained how bourbon ages, how the wood breathes and the seasons change the whiskey inside. She asked good questions, seemed genuinely interested, and I started thinking maybe having help around here wouldn't be the worst thing. The weekend, we worked. I had a bottling run scheduled for a 4-year batch, and she insisted on helping. I showed her how to siphon from barrel to bottle, how to cork and label, and she was quick and careful and didn't waste a drop. We fell into an easy rhythm, and by Monday I'd drawn up that employment contract and she signed it. Relief written all over her face. The next week she learned fast, helping me prepare mash, monitoring fermentation temperatures, even starting to identify flavor notes when we did barrel tastings. She fixed a broken conveyor belt in the bottling line with nothing but a wrench and some wire. Said she'd learned mechanical work from her uncle's shop. And suddenly my production was running smoother than it had in months. It was the end of that 2nd week when everything shifted. We were cleaning up after closing the tasting room, and she mentioned offhand that her uncle kept asking about her dad's old stuff. Said she should throw it all out. That it was just junk taking up space in her storage unit. "What kind of stuff?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Papers, notebooks, I don't know. Dad's things from before he died. I never looked through it. Too hard." Something clicked in my head. "Can we go look? Maybe there's something about this debt in there." She agreed, and the next day we drove the hour up to Louisville, to a storage facility on the south side, where she had a 10-by-10 unit packed with boxes. We dug through her father's life, old photos that made her tear up, furniture covered in dust, and then I found it. A leather journal, worn and stained, with initials stamped on the cover, M.B. Marcus Brennan, her father. Inside were bourbon recipes, pages and pages of them, handwritten in careful script. Mash bills, yeast strains, aging notes, all dated from the 90s and early 2000s. And then, near the back, one marked in red ink. The One, it said. Pre-Prohibition style. Grandpa's legacy. Below it was a recipe so detailed and specific it made my hands shake. This wasn't just a bourbon recipe. This was history. The last entry, dated the year before her father died, said, "This is it. The recipe they've been looking for. Worth everything. For Ivy when she's ready." I looked at her, kneeling in the dust next to me. "Your dad wasn't just some guy. He was a bourbon historian. And this," I held up the journal, "this is treasure. Worth more than you know." She didn't understand yet, but she would. We drove back to Bardstown with the journal locked in my truck's safe box. And when we pulled into the distillery lot at 9 that night, there was a black Cadillac SUV waiting, engine running. A man stepped out, 50-something in an expensive suit that didn't belong in my parking lot. And behind him, looking guilty as hell, was Roy Brennan. The man smiled, cold and calculating. "Jesse Moran, I'm Dalton Cruz. I believe you have my property here." He gestured at Ivy. "Time she came back with us. We've got work for her to do." I stepped between them and Ivy, every instinct screaming danger. "She's not going anywhere. And whatever scam you're running, it ends now." Dalton's smile didn't waver. "See you in court, Moran." They left, and Ivy grabbed my arm, shaking. "What just happened?" I looked down at the journal in my hand, then at her. "That wasn't about debt. That was about this. And we're going to find out exactly what they want with it." We didn't sleep that night. How could we? I made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint while Ivy sat at my kitchen table with her laptop, and we started digging into Dalton Cruz like our lives depended on it. Because honestly, it was starting to feel like they might. What we found made my stomach turn. Dalton ran a company called Cruz Premium Spirits, supposedly a distributor and small distillery operation out of Louisville. But the deeper we dug, the shadier it got. Online forums for bourbon collectors were full of whispers about him, people questioning whether bottles he sold were authentic, stories about rare pre-prohibition, bourbons that showed up at auction with perfect labels, but something off about the taste. One guy claimed he'd paid $35,000 for a bottle, supposedly from 1910 had it tested, and found out the whiskey inside was maybe 5 years old. But he couldn't prove. Dalton had sold him a fake because the paper trail was clean. And by the time the test came back, Dalton's lawyers had buried him in cease and desist letters. It clicked together like the pieces of a lock I didn't want to open. "Your dad's recipe?" I told Ivy as the sun started coming up over the rick house. "That's what this is about. Dalton's running a counterfeit operation, selling new bourbon in old bottles with fake labels. But if he had a real pre-prohibition recipe, one that actually tasted like the old stuff, he could fool even the experts. Sell bottles for 20, 30, 50,000 apiece. That journal's worth millions to a guy like him." She stared at the screen, at a photo of Dalton shaking hands with some bourbon. Industry big shot at a charity event, looking every bit the legitimate businessman. "And my uncle just handed me over like bait. We need to call him," I said. "Get him to admit what's really going on." She pulled out her phone, hands shaking, and dialed Roy's number on speaker. He picked up on the fourth ring, his voice groggy and defensive. "Ivy, it's 6 in the morning. Why did you really send me to Jesse?" she asked, and her voice was stronger than I expected. "What does Dalton want with me?" There was a long pause, the kind where you can hear someone deciding how much truth to tell. "I owe him money. Real money. Gambling debts that got out of hand. He said if you worked for Jesse for a while, we'd be square. I didn't know he'd show up like that." "What does he want, Uncle Roy?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know, Ivy, I swear. Just come home. We'll figure this out." She hung up without saying goodbye, and I could see the betrayal settling into her bones like cold. "He's lying," I said quietly. "He knows exactly what Dalton's after." The next day I called in a favor from an old contact, Dr. Ellen Cho, a bourbon historian up at the University of Kentucky who'd known my dad back in the day. We drove to Lexington and met her in her office. A cramped space overflowing with old bottles and books about distilling history. I showed her photos of the journal, and I watched her eyes go wide. "This is Marcus Brennan's work," she breathed, scrolling through the images on my phone. "We thought all of this was lost. He was doing research nobody else was touching, tracking down old yeast strains, interviewing descendants of pre-prohibition master distillers. Then he just disappeared from the scene about 15 years ago. I always wondered what happened to him." "He died," Ivy said softly. "Car accident." I was 12. Ellen looked at her with something like reverence. "Then you're his daughter. And this," she gestured at the phone, "this is the Holy Grail. If this recipe works, it's worth tens of millions in brand value alone. But if the wrong people get it, they'll counterfeit it. Damage the entire industry's credibility." She looked at me hard. "Keep this locked up and watch your back." We didn't have to wait long for Dalton to make his next move. 3 days later, a courier showed up at the distillery with a court summons. Dalton and Roy had filed a lawsuit in Jefferson County Court in Louisville, claiming my father had entered into a legal equipment sale and consulting contract with Roy, that Ivy had been designated as collateral labor to satisfy the debt, and that I was in breach of contract by refusing to honor the agreement. It was insane, dressed up human trafficking disguised as business law, but it was filed and a judge had accepted it. I called Tom, my lawyer, and he showed up at the distillery within 2 hours, reading through the complaint with his jaw getting tighter by the line. "This is one of the most offensive things I've ever seen filed in a court," he said. "But they've got a judge who's letting it proceed, which means we have to respond. We need to prove that contract is forged and expose what Dalton's really after." We spent the next week building our defense like we were preparing for war. Tom hired a forensic document examiner, a woman out of Cincinnati who specialized in signature analysis. She took samples of my dad's real signature from liquor license applications and business filings, compared them to the one on the contract. And within 2 days, she'd found half a dozen inconsistencies. The signature was forged, the ink dating was wrong for the claimed date, and the notary who supposedly witnessed it had retired. 3 months before the document was allegedly signed, we subpoenaed Roy's bank records and found exactly what I expected. Payments from Dalton going back 8 months. Deposits of $5,000 here, $10,000 there, adding up to nearly 60 grand. Roy wasn't just in debt to Dalton. He was on the payroll. Ivy processed all of this in waves. Some days she was angry, throwing herself into work at the distillery, scrubbing fermentation tanks with a fury that worried me. Other nights she'd break down crying over the betrayal, and I'd sit with her on the roof deck of my apartment, not saying much, just being there while she worked through the fact that the only family she had left had sold her out for cash. But something else was happening too. In between the legal prep and the fear, we were making bourbon together. I proposed we test her father's recipe, see if it actually worked, and the idea lit something up in her. We spent days sourcing the exact grains the recipe called for. Heirloom corn from a heritage farm in Woodford County, specialty malted barley, wheat from a mill that still used stone grinding. I tracked down the yeast strain through old contacts, a culture that had been preserved in a library at a brewing school, descended from strains used before Prohibition. The mash we made was beautiful. The smell coming off the fermenter was like nothing I'd produced before, rich and complex, hints of fruit and spice that told me we were onto something special. Ivy would stand at the tank with me in the early mornings, checking temperatures and sugar levels, and I'd teach her what to look for, how to read the fermentation, and she'd absorb it all like she'd been waiting her whole life to understand this piece of her father. One night, after we'd run the first distillation, and the new make whiskey was cooling in the still, she turned to me in the dim light of the production floor and said, "I think he would have loved this, teaching me, seeing his recipe come to life. He would have been proud of you," I said. "Not for this, for everything, how you've handled all of it." She looked at me then, really looked, and the distance we'd been keeping collapsed. The kiss happened slow, tentative at first, like we were both asking permission, then deeper, real, tasting like bourbon and possibility. When we pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine. "This complicates things," she whispered. Yeah, I agreed, but maybe that's okay. Dalton wasn't content to let things play out in court. A week before the trial date, on a Friday night when Ivy and I were working late finishing a bottling run, we heard glass breaking from the direction of my office. I grabbed a wooden mallet we used for knocking barrel bungs loose and told Ivy to call 911, then moved toward the sound. 2 guys were rifling through my desk, pulling out drawers and scattering papers. One of them, a big guy with a shaved head, turned and saw me. "Where's the journal?" he growled. I didn't answer, just moved between them and the door, blocking their exit. They rushed me and things got messy fast. One pulled a knife, slashed at me, caught my forearm enough to draw blood. I swung the mallet, connected with his shoulder, heard him yell. Then Ivy was there with the industrial hose we used for cleaning tanks, blasting them both with cold water at full pressure. They stumbled, cursed, and ran past me out the back door before the police could arrive. The Nelson County Sheriff took our statements, dusted for prints, and found matches for 2 guys with records, both known associates of Dalton Cruz. The sheriff, a no-nonsense woman named Hayes, looked at me seriously. "This is bigger than a local dispute. You're dealing with organized crime, possibly. I'd recommend getting federal involved." I made a call the next morning to the TTB, the federal agency that regulates bourbon production, and got connected to an investigator named Sarah Ortiz who specialized in counterfeiting cases. She drove down from Louisville that afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to our story without interrupting. When we finished, she sat back and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a hunter who'd just found the trail. "I've been watching Dalton Cruz for 3 years," she said. "Suspected counterfeit sales totaling over $2 million, but never enough evidence to prosecute. If he's after a pre-prohibition recipe to enhance his operation, and he's willing to commit fraud and assault to get it, then you two just became my best chance at taking him down." We coordinated with her and Tom. The civil case would go forward, expose Dalton's motives in open court, and the federal case would build in parallel. Sarah placed surveillance on the distillery, unmarked cars watching the property at night. That Sunday evening, 10 days before trial, my phone rang from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice was distorted, run through some kind of filter, but the message was clear. "Drop the case. Give us the recipe, or the distillery burns and you with it." Ivy had heard it from across the room, and her face went white. "We should just give it to them, Jesse. It's not worth dying for." I pulled her close, felt her shaking against me. "Your father spent his life on this. We're not letting criminals steal it. We fight." That night, we moved the journal to a bank-safe deposit box in Bardstown, locked it away where nobody could get to it. Without going through steel and alarms and security cameras, Agent Ortiz increased the surveillance, and Tom filed a motion to expedite the trial. The battle lines were drawn. In 3 days, we'd walk into that courthouse and either expose Dalton for what he was, or lose everything. But standing there in the distillery with Ivy in my arms, surrounded by barrels of aging, bourbon and the smell of her father's legacy coming to life, I knew one thing for certain. We weren't backing down. Not now, not ever. The morning of the trial, I woke up at 4 and couldn't get back to sleep. Just lay there in bed listening to Ivy breathe in the room next to mine and thinking about everything that could go wrong. We'd spent the last 3 days prepping with Tom and Agent Ortiz, going over testimony until I could recite it in my sleep. But walking into a courtroom to face down a guy like Dalton Cruz with his expensive lawyers and his connections, that was different than practicing in an office. We drove to Louisville in my truck, an hour of tense silence broken only by the radio playing old country songs neither of us was really listening to. Then Tom called Dr. Ellen Cho, and she brought the truth about what this was really about. She explained who Marcus Brennan was, Ivy's father, a bourbon historian who'd spent decades researching pre-prohibition, distilling methods. She talked about the journal, the recipes, and dropped the bomb about its value. Conservative estimate, $10 million in intellectual property and brand potential. To someone in the counterfeiting business, it would be worth even more as a tool to defraud collectors. The courtroom stirred at that, whispers running through the gallery. Judge Keene banged her gavel once, and it went quiet. Roy took the stand after lunch, and that's when things fell apart for Dalton. Tom had negotiated an immunity deal for Roy in exchange for testimony, and the man looked like he'd aged 10 years since I'd seen him 2 weeks ago. He admitted everything, voice shaking. How Dalton had approached him 8 months back. How he'd known about the journal because Ivy had mentioned her father's old papers years ago. How Dalton had offered him $50,000 plus, forgiveness of his gambling debts to get it. The plan was to send Ivy away with a fake debt so Roy could search her apartment for the journal. When he didn't find it there, Dalton got angry and things escalated. Roy looked at Ivy when he said that part. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but she just turned away. Morrison tried to object, claimed Roy's testimony was coerced, but Judge Keene shut him down hard. "The witness has immunity. I'll hear what he has to say." The final witness was Agent Sarah Ortiz from the TTB, and she brought the federal hammer down. She presented evidence of Dalton's counterfeit operation going back 3 years. Fake labels for extinct bourbon brands, new whiskey relabeled as 50 to 100-year-old bottles, sales to collectors totaling over $2 million in fraud. She had receipts, testimonies from 3 collectors who'd been duped, and documentation of the illegal operation. This wasn't about a contract dispute, she testified. This was organized fraud. Mr. Cruz wanted Marcus Brennan's recipe to produce authentic-tasting counterfeit, bourbon that could fool even experts. He was willing to commit multiple felonies to obtain it. Dalton's lawyer tried to mount a defense, claimed it was all circumstantial, but the evidence was overwhelming. Judge Keene didn't even take a recess to deliberate. She ruled from the bench, her voice sharp and clear. "The contract is void. Forgery has been proven beyond reasonable doubt. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Cruz will pay all legal fees for the plaintiff. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to federal prosecutors for criminal charges." She'd barely finished speaking when federal agents, who'd been waiting in the hallway, came in and arrested Dalton right there in the courtroom. He tried to protest, started yelling about his lawyers and his rights, but they cuffed him and read him his charges: fraud, counterfeiting, conspiracy, attempted extortion. Bail was denied on the spot. Outside on the courthouse steps, media was waiting. Local news crews and bourbon industry reporters who'd caught wind of the story. Ivy stood next to me, and when they asked her for a statement, she took a breath and spoke clearly. "My father left me something precious. Not money, but knowledge. And I'm going to honor his legacy the right way," I added. "We'll be producing a limited edition bourbon using Marcus Brennan's recipe. All proceeds go to bourbon education scholarships in his name." The cameras loved it, and by that evening, the story was everywhere. Back at the distillery that night, exhausted but finally able to breathe, we sat on the roof deck watching the sun set over the rickhouse. Ivy leaned against me, and I could feel the tension draining out of her for the first time since she'd showed up at my door. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said quietly. "No family left." I pulled the small box from my pocket, the one I'd been carrying for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. "You've got me. And this place, stay, build it with me, marry me." I opened the box. Inside was a ring I'd made myself, a thin band carved from bourbon barrel stave wood, the charred oak sanded smooth and polished, with a small diamond set in it that had been my grandmother's. She looked at it, then at me, and started crying and laughing at the same time. Yes. God, yes. 6 months later, everything had changed. We'd renamed the operation Moran and Brennan Craft Distillery, made it a true partnership. The first batch of Marcus's legacy bourbon, 500 bottles at $200 each, sold out in 24 hours, with reviews calling it extraordinary, historic, game-changing. We had a waiting list of 5,000 people for the next batch. Dalton got convicted on all counts, sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay 3. million in restitution. To the collectors he'd defrauded. His whole operation got dismantled. And the bourbon industry breathed easier knowing he was done. Roy finished probation and sent Ivy one letter. "I'm sorry. Your father would be ashamed of me, but proud of you." She read it once and put it in a drawer. Maybe someday she'd respond, maybe not. We got married at the distillery in October. Small ceremony with Dr. Cho officiating because she'd gotten ordained online. Just for us, and bourbon industry friends filling the Rick House for the reception. We lived above the production floor. Worked side by side every day. Expanded the operation, hired 3 employees, and became a featured stop on the Bourbon Trail. One afternoon I found Ivy in the Rick House, pulling a sample from barrel 47, the first barrel of her father's recipe aging toward its 4th year. She tasted it, noted the caramel and vanilla, the hint of cherry and oak, and I watched from the doorway. "What?" she asked, catching me staring. "Just thinking. You came here believing you were payment for a debt. Now you're the reason this place exists." She walked over, kissed me, tasted like bourbon and forever. We're the reason, together. The barrels aged around us, the angel's share evaporating into the Kentucky air. And I knew we'd built something that would last. Not because we had to, but because we'd chosen it. Her father's legacy wasn't just the recipe. It was the truth that sometimes betrayal leads you exactly where you need to be. You just have to be brave enough to claim what's yours.